This is my follow-up to the first video on modern apostles versus biblical apostles. This one I'm going to be a bit more positive. I talked about some of the ways in which some of the people claiming to be apostles now did not fit the biblical model, or we have to ask whether they fit the biblical model or if they have the measure of rule that they seem to be claiming for themselves. Just to review, Paul had a measure of rule in the churches in Corinth because that church came to existence through his ministry. I'd also like to add 1 Corinthians 9, in which it says that ye are the seal of my apostleship in the Lord. The Corinthian church was evidence that Paul was an apostle, that Paul was sent by Jesus. The grace of God that was in him as an apostle worked, and that church was formed, and that was evidence that he was an apostle. There are a couple of other types of other apostles as well. 1 Corinthians 4 seems to indicate that Apollos was an apostle because Paul's talking about himself and Apollos, and then he says that God has set us apostles forth last, and he begins to talk about their sufferings. So Apollos was sent to Corinth after the church in Corinth was already in existence, but he strengthened apparently through teaching and evangelism when the church was still in a very infant stage. And he strengthened and helped establish that church, and also perhaps the church grew quite a bit through evangelism. So apparently Paul believed that Apollos was sent as apostle as well, and that and Paul says of the other apostles saw I none save James, the Lord's brother, in Galatians. So he apparently considered James to be an apostle. According to tradition, the Lord had appeared to James, and it's also in 1 Corinthians 15, that the Lord had appeared to James after the resurrection. And Paul mentions the Lord's brothers in 1 Corinthians 9, where he talks about himself and Peter or Cephas and the Lord's brethren having a right to live of the gospel, and they had a right to travel around with wives, which Paul didn't have, to travel around with a sister, a wife, a believing wife. So apparently James was doing a bit of traveling and strengthening churches as well. So there's a bit of itineration in being a sent one. About the traveling around and ministering is also an element here that we see in the Bible. Although the 12, they could stay in Jerusalem for an extended period of time. They did go out on this evangelistic teaching mission when they got their apostolic commission, which is Paul was called that after he was sent on his evangelistic teaching mission. Now I'd like to talk about the idea of can some modern ministers be apostles? And the previous one was about some of the ways in which the ideas about modern ideas about apostleship don't match the biblical ideas. But I'd also like to point out that there is a reason to think that there may be apostles today, or that there are apostles today. And in Ephesians 4, it says that apostles, prophets, evangelists, pastors, or teachers are given until we all reach the full measure of the stature of Christ, and we're not tossed around to and fro with every wind of doctrine. So I would conclude that is a pretty good case for the continuance of apostleship. And another thing to point out is that passage teaches that Jesus ascended on high and received and gave the gift of apostleship to men after his ascension, and the 12 were made apostles before the ascension. So this is a post-ascension gift, and that Paul received it, and Barnabas received it, and various other men were gifted to be sent ones after the 12 were selected. Yeah, and it's not the case that it was just Paul, or that Paul was a replacement for the 12. You can read in 1 Corinthians 15, Judas was dead, and Jesus appeared to the 12 before appearing to Paul. So Paul did not consider himself to be one of the 12, according to what he said. Now, the idea of there being apostles now, the church planting ministers who fit the mold of apostleship in Scripture, I believe that's possible. And a good book to some good writings on that topic would be from Watchman Nee, Concerning Our Mission, or it's in a shortened version called The Normal Christian Church Life. They added the word church because The Normal Christian Life was so popular from the publishers that edited down his works to make an abridged version. Yeah, if you look this up, you can see that he makes a good argument for the continuance of the apostolic gift as a church planting role, and you see how that a lot of times, a lot of the concepts that we have about minister of the gospel don't really apply to the apostles, because they would go and they would preach in another city. They'd preach in another city. He gives an example of people saying, "Oh, Paul, stay here, preach to us every week. We'll sit here and listen." But no, that's not the Lord's plan for the church. The Lord wanted different people to have gifts in the body, and as Paul said, every one of you has a psalm, has a doctrine, has a tongue, has a revelation, has an interpretation. So we see that as a model for what to do in church, is to have mutual interaction, or mutual edification rather, where the saints take turns using their gifts to edify the body. We've replaced that with a one-man pastoral sermon every week, as opposed to what the Bible actually says. That not just one person is supposed to minister. For you may all prophesy one by one, that all may be strengthened and all may be encouraged, as it says in 1 Corinthians chapter 14. Now, I used to moderate a church planting discussion list, and on this church planting discussion list, there were several church planters. A couple of times we discussed apostleship, and I just asked, there's a verse that says the signs of an apostle were that Paul's exhibited the signs of apostle among the Corinthians with signs, wonders, and mighty deeds. So some people interpret the signs of the apostles there, since it's talking about suffering in the passage, to be Paul's suffering, and it was accompanied with supernatural signs, wonders, and mighty deeds. But typically people take that passage to mean that signs, wonders, and mighty deeds are signs of an apostle. So if somebody has planted several churches, and they do signs and wonders, and they say, "Hey, God called me to be an apostle," or "God called me to be apostle, and someone prophesied over me after that, and I did apostolic ministry, and I'm an apostle," I can, that is very feasible considering what I see in the New Testament. Of course, you need to test those who say they are apostles, make sure their doctrine conforms with Scripture, and are they bearing the fruit of an apostle? Are they doing apostolic fruit? Someone could think he's an apostle and not be, and not because he's he's leading people into sin or teaching things against the nature of Christ, like some of the false teachers in the Bible, but rather because he's has some doctrinal error that needs to be corrected. Or other people may receive an apostolic calling and then just believe some traditional notions about what an apostle is. Actually, there was I may make another video about some of the historical issues with apostolic reformations, or if I don't have time on this video. But let's consider some of the historical aspects. In the latter rain movement in the 50s, there were a lot of people that noticed in the Bible that first someone prophesied over Paul and Barnabas, and then they ministered in apostolic ministry. And so they had a practice of prophesying over people, and then someone get prophesied that they're an apostle, and they'd be considered an apostle, and be, right in those churches, they'd be considered an apostle. And some of them, though, according to, I believe it was he didn't name it as a latter rain movement, but Kenneth Hagin, the only actual book from Kenneth Hagin I ever read, He Gave Gifts Unto Men, talked about a time where there's a guy who said, "I'm an apostle, everybody send me your tithes," send out letters to all the pastors in the area. And there are people that, if I remember it's in that book, that didn't do any apostolic work, but somebody prophesied they're an apostle. Prophecies need to be judged, because there's a possibility someone could be a false prophet or prophesy falsely. And so you can't just accept everything at face value. We need to test and discern. And if someone is prophesied they're an apostle, but they maybe in the future they'll bear fruit of it, or maybe you need to discern whether it's from the Lord or not. So actually, though, it is biblical. One of the people on the list I was talking about, he had planted, I believe, 18 churches in the United States. According to his testimony on there, he had done signs and wonders, because I'd asked, how many of you are in apostolic ministry have done signs and wonders? And he sensed the Lord was calling him to apostleship, and someone prophesied it over him. And I believe that's before he went out and started these 18 house churches. And now, or the last I heard, he was training people that were doing Islamic type ministry. And I know his book is well known in certain circles for training people to plant churches. So, that's the type of model. If someone says they're an apostle, and that's their experience, and that's what they've done, and that's their credentials, that very much seems to fit with the biblical model. So there are other people that do a little bit different types of ministries that claim to be apostles, that I could see how that could fit as well. But just saying I'm fatherly, elders are supposed to be fatherly, we should have fatherly people, but being fatherly is not enough to make someone an apostle. And being a bishop or an archbishop type in a traditional kind of setting up a structure that's set up with some sort of person over pastors and archbishop type situation, and calling it apostle, I don't see where that is in the Bible. I don't see where being a denominational leader makes someone an apostle. I just don't see that in the scriptures. And so anyway, please consider this if you're looking into the role of apostleship. It is a biblical gift. We need to acknowledge the biblical gifts and be blessed. And someone can minister to you. An apostle could come and minister to you without being your father in the Lord, and you could receive that ministry and be blessed by it. And my wife got a prophetic word for a man that he was an apostle, and he said the Lord had told him that when he went to this island where he preached, and it was a big shock to him, I guess, to receive that prophecy as well. But he had just planted 3 churches on that island, from what I heard. So, God bless him. Nice talking to you.